let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
Strategist and host of That Trippi Show and my new show, On the Ground with Joe Trippi. With me is the other Joe, celebrated journalist Joe Klein. Joe's been covering political campaigns for a long time. And I've sure been running them for just about as long. Sometimes we agree, other times not so much. But today we have special guest David Dunn, a partner with General Wesley Clark and global advisory firm Envera Partners. Joe, I'll hand it over to the other Joe, and let's get started. Where do you want to go?
Well, before we started, David was saying that not much has happened in the last week in Iran. So, David, I want to ask you a really basic question. Is the glass, given this ceasefire, is the glass half empty or is it 3/4 empty?
For whom?
For us.
If you and my us, the United States and the West and the international system that's been in operation for the 50 years, I'd say it's less than half full. This war is not yet over, but there's some historical consequences that are already becoming clear, and I fear are likely to be permanent, and they're not in the United States' favor, or the global international order's favor, for that matter.
Is the Strait of Hormuz right up there at the top of that list of considerations? Because last I saw, and this is live on Wednesday, April 8th, the afternoon, only 4 tankers have gone through the straits since this so-called ceasefire was announced, and they're being controlled still by Iran, which was most certainly not the case before Donald Trump invaded.
Well, there are more than 1,000 vessels that are stuck in the Persian Gulf right now, and even under normal conditions, it would take more than 2 weeks to clear a backlog of that size. With these risks, and I just think the most consequential detail in the so-called settlement is hiding in plain sight. The immediate crisis is diffused, but the terms of the reopening still leave Iran in military control of the most important waterway in the global economy, and that's your point, Joe. And I think that is the point. So the question that you have to ask is: does stability in the global energy flows now depend on accommodating Iran on a host of their demands? And it would appear to be the answer to that question is yes. So I'm afraid. Unless things change, that is where we stand.
But David, where
I quote, let's use the words of the Iranians here to try to understand, because it's a little ambiguous exactly what it is that's been agreed to get this 2-week cessation of hostilities, which does not include in Lebanon as far as Israel and the United States goes, and it does include Lebanon as far as Iran goes. So this may fall out of bed.
And apparently doesn't.
That was the question I had. The question I have is, can we start with,
I'm sorry,
what are the odds of this ceasefire holding? Hello?
David?
Yeah. Can you hear
me? What are the odds of the ceasefire holding is the question on the table.
I'd say less than 50%. Simply because, look, in classical negotiations, diplomatic negotiations that I'm familiar with, some of which I've been involved in over the years, indeed in the Gulf states, I think it's important to realize that successful negotiations almost always start out with a group of things both parties agree on, and a group of things both parties have as aspirational goals. the fundamental problem we have in this negotiation is it's not clear that the parties agree on the basics. And when that's the case, the opportunity for confidence building measures to expand what's agreed upon as common ground is very limited.
And to complete the picture here, I've also read today that Iran is still bombing the Gulf states. So that emphasizes the point that you've made, is that we don't have very many points of agreement. In fact, the only one that I can say with confidence is that we have an agreement that the United States isn't going to bomb Iran for 2 weeks. And Israel is kind of on board for that. But I have had some experience dealing with the Iranians and with countries that try to negotiate with them. And they are perhaps the world's worst negotiators because they think they're the world's best. And I spoke to an Indian diplomat who has negotiated with the Iranians. Those two countries are allies. And I said, what's it like negotiating with them? And the Indian said, oh, it's impossible. You think you have a deal, and then they take 2 steps back. And that is classic Persian negotiating technique.
Well, you've also had the Speaker of the Iranian Parliament say that declare that the U.S. has already violated the agreement. You've got, I think, the UAE's sent missiles or towards Iran. I mean, it doesn't seem to me that it seems pretty shaky here. And
Yeah.
David, maybe you could get into some of the different possible ways this, from it taking hold to it falling apart. What are what are you seeing, in terms of the region? And for instance, Israel alone has a vote in this, and it doesn't sound to me like Netanyahu's got a real interest in keeping the ceasefire going. But your perspective.
Well, let's start with the basics on the Iranian side. First of all, we've destroyed a good bit of their communications command and control system. So we and the Israelis. So consequently, it's difficult for these leaders to communicate with each other in Iran to achieve some kind of a consensus. Secondly, recent history proves that to the degree you communicate openly or communicate even liberally, there's a good chance you will be targeted. So there's the whole concept internally in Iran of achieving some kind of a consensus is challenged by that. The second aspect in Iran that we have to remember is that the leadership has changed dramatically in the last 2-3 weeks, and you have a new leadership that is no longer centered in the clerical council of experts, but rather centered in 31 different IRGC commanders who command 31 different provinces in the state of Iran. And among these commanders is the head of asymmetrical warfare, a guy by the name of Zolgadar. And Zolgadar is the new secretary of the National Security Council of Iran. In that position, replacing Larijani, among others, he holds a veto. And so what I'm trying to explain is that for people to understand is that the decision-making infrastructure in Iran coming to some agreement internally is challenged in a number of different ways. There are new personalities. There's no clear way to communicate with each other. There's no clear established hierarchy that's still being worked out. And there are differences of opinion about what the response to the situation is. Now let's turn to the question of what's the greatest threat right now to the ceasefire. The greatest threat right now to the ceasefire is Israel rejects the notion that it cannot attack Lebanon and Hezbollah sites in Lebanon. Trump agrees with Israel publicly today. And the Iranian position, as you said, Joe, Ghalibaf announced, well, that's not what we agreed to. So the ceasefire may already be broken, as Ghalibaf suggests. I don't think you can tell yet. Only 2 ships have been allowed to transit the Strait of Hormuz in these last 12 hours. So it's at best a very tenuous situation.
Well, one of the biggest shipping companies in the world responded to CNBC and said that they have no intention of even attempting to move their ships through. That they see no safe way to do it, and they're not. And you got to assume a lot of companies are making that same decision right now and see whether this holds or not.
One of the things that we should consider is the hyperbolic quality of the rhetoric on both sides. David just mentioned Ghalibaf, and the Iranians are well known for baloney slicing to the nth degree. On the American side, our quote of the week, in fact, our quote of the millennium perhaps, is from Donald Trump, who said,
"You got that, Sam?
Have we brought that up?" Well, he did, yeah. He said the night before, "A whole civilization will die tonight, never to be brought back again. I don't want that to happen." And then he went on and on and on. But a whole civilization will die tonight. That is a quote that will live for the ages. And it may stand as a unique moment in the history of the United States, because that sort of thing is this sort of thing we never said before. We never talked about crushing civilizations. We talked about unconditional surrender in World War II, but the idea of vaporizing Iran, which Trump raised, and I think, knowing Trump from the old country, it was a tactic. It was a fake, and Iran chose not to call his bluff. But I think that if you're looking at this from Donald Trump's perspective, right now he has declared victory and gone home. And what David is saying is that the chances are that he may be the only person around who thinks that, right?
Yeah, let me give you a little bit more of a sort of a historical perspective on this. I work with most of the Gulf, well, many of the Gulf states, Oman, UAE, Qatar, and Kuwait, pretty closely. And I think I understand for about 25 years on and off, and I think I understand their as counsel to the government, and I think I understand their mentality pretty well. They learned a lesson from this brief war, and the lesson they learned from this brief war, they learned many lessons, but the most important lesson they learned from this brief war is that they had an agreement with the United States that they would rely on the United States for the defense of their countries, their sovereignty, their geographical integrity, the operation of their economies, and in return for which they would supply the United States with a significant amount of weapons purchases, and they would price their products to the global market in dollars. I think that the lesson they learned coming out of this war is that the United States was unable to defend them. That the United States was not only unable to defend them militarily, but it was unable to defend their infrastructure, which is their lifeline, which is their business model, which is their economy. And finally, and most importantly, the United States, according to the position of the president so far, is prepared to allow their enemy across the Gulf to decide when and under what terms they can export anything from their economies. So that means a historical realignment of some considerable importance. And it probably means that a much closer relationship between those Gulf states and China. It probably means a much more important push on the part of those Gulf states, already started quietly by Saudi Arabia and UAE, for nuclear weapons. And it probably means some possibility in time for pricing goods coming out of the Gulf in yuan and not US dollars. Mm-hmm. Those are all three pretty important historical considerations.
And none of them good for the United States.
In fact, I think I read today that that already the $2 million per tanker toll that the Iranians are imposing will be collectible in either yuan or in Bitcoin.
Well, and I think, Joe, knowing the Gulf the way, at least in my,
they won't take Bitcoin.
No, they'll take. Well, I don't know what they'll take, but they are very economically pragmatic nations and leaders. I suspect that Iran is going to. I haven't read this anywhere, but my gut tells me this is what's going to happen. Iran is going to demand war reparations from the Gulf exporters in return for those ships being allowed to export products from their economies. And those war reparations will not be simply the tariff on the ships. There will be substantial payments demanded by Iran of these Gulf states, further making the point that the United States is simply not in a position to protect them.
Well, David, among the things that we don't know, and this goes back to your original point, is we really don't know the nature of the new Iranian leadership. We didn't know the nature of the old Iranian leadership. There are people who have been telling me for 15 years that, the Ayatollah was only a fig leaf for the Revolutionary Guard Corps. And it seems to me, and I'd love your assessment of this, the IRGC, Revolutionary Guards, are at a crossroads right now. They have been pursuing a policy that was essentially drawn up by Qasem Soleimani, who was assassinated by Trump during his first term. And that was to be aggressive in the region, to develop proxies, to see this as a holy war between Shia Iran and largely Sunni nations surrounding it. And that hasn't gone very well in an objective sense. They have been pulverized, and we can't forget about that. The question is whether that's going to lead to a change of strategy, a crucial change of strategy on the part of the IRGC, because they control 20 to 40% of the Iranian economy. And might the new leadership just decide to play nice rather than be so antagonistic? Is it possible that there's going to be some give on their side?
Well, let's look at it from the perspective of the new leadership, the IRGC, trying to decide what posture to take domestically. They come out of this with a shattered infrastructure, runaway inflation, skyrocketing unemployment, poisoned commercial ties with the Gulf states, acute dependence on sanctions relief just to stabilize their macroeconomic situation, and the thing that any leadership should be concerned with is maintaining domestic tranquility, and that starts with security first, and then secondly with economic stability. And I don't know, and I think it's a central question, what the political orientation of the new IRGC will be, and what they consider their greater threat. Is the greater threat to discontinue the conflict, to stop the any low-level amount of conflict, and risk the possibility that the nationalism that is so typical of the Persian nation in a time of self-defense would dissipate, and people would begin to feel the economic consequences and come out into the street and threaten their authority? Or is it better to start the rebuilding process, trust that the people of the country will give them some time to reconstitute the economy, and hope that they can maintain order while they try to accomplish that? You have to remember that also that worst case, if that process, whichever way it plays out, fails to maintain any kind of national integrity in political terms, we have 31 warlords on our hands. They have the guns, and they have the economic stranglehold in every one of these provinces.
Well, but I think that there's more cohesion to Iran as a civilization than that, which is why Trump's use of the word civilization was such a profound red flag. I don't know that it's going to crack up into 31 different warlords, David, because you also have the Quds Force, which is the best fighting force that the Iranians have in either the IRGC or in the Iranian army. The question is, as you said, whether or not rebuilding the country, which is a far more middle class and better educated company than a lot of its neighbors, do they? And in the past, the people who ruled the country were very, very cautious about the ways that they acted offensively. They did it surreptitiously through proxies. They did terror attacks, but up until now, they haven't done the frontal assault because they were still in many ways recovering from the Iran-Iraq war of the 1980s, where they took 1 million casualties.
Right.
You walk the streets of Tehran and you see people shaking uncontrollably with signs around their necks saying chemical victims of the war. And they're not talking about this war, they're talking about the Iraq war.
Well, I think that we have to remember in recent history in Iran, there has been a degree of federalism in the way the government has organized its services and the way the government has delivered services to its people. These provincial structures have been maintained and operated relatively effectively under some extraordinary sanctions pressures. So I think your point, Joe, that there's that underlying federalism that's there. I just don't know the way in which decision making for that underlying structure will manifest itself at the national level. I just don't know, and I don't think any of us can know until we see the terms of the peace and the steps that the new leadership takes to try to address the extraordinary distress their country is in right now, just logistically, economically, employment-wise, price-wise, food supplies, etc.
So, David, I mean, the one thing though here is, at some level, okay, ceasefire. Let's assume negotiations somehow do move forward. Somebody has to cave, right? Because I mean, they either have to, you can come and get the uranium out. We won't, we'll abide and not enrich it. or any number of things. Straits of Hormuz, they control it. They're saying that they intend to keep control of it. It seems to me that in a ceasefire situation, the leverage that Trump may have had with I'll shut down Karg Island in hopes of using that to get the strait reopened. That I don't know. I don't see the leverage there. So how does this? We know how far apart the two sides are on 3 or 4 or 5 different pieces. And again, given the organizational reality of Iran's, the new leadership having trouble even communicating at times, how does that? Who's likeliest? How does this play out in your view? What are they likely to cave to this stuff, or is it that Trump went in to supposedly regime change not happen, get the nuclear material not happen, the Straits of Hormuz, which wasn't a problem, now is. Is it just there's no way out? It's just going to be no way for Trump to. He'll claim victory, obviously, but is there any way that he can get the negotiations would get the Iranians to give up the strait or the nukes? Because then there's nothing. If they have nothing at that point if they give up both.
I think that the lesson that the Iranian leadership, whoever and whatever it is or becomes, the lesson they have taken from this conflict is that exercising with asymmetrical power, relatively easy to maintain, control over the most important economic choke point in the world is leverage far beyond that which, economically speaking, that which enriched uranium gave them. Mm-hmm. Does it give them the leverage they would have with a nuclear weapon? Well, no, on a security standpoint. But from an economic standpoint, the answer may be yes. And from the standpoint of bending other nations to their will, I think the Straits of Hormuz is a far more important point of leverage than some enriched uranium buried somewhere at Fordo. But I think there are a lot of people that will be debating this very set of questions, Joe. And I heard in the White House press briefing an hour or so ago that the press secretary is saying that the president is committed, that a sine qua non of these negotiations is achieving the removal of the enriched uranium from Iran. There may be some circumstances under which, for maintaining domestic order and for achieving economic recovery, the IRGC figures, well, that's a good near-term give. That's a good near-term trade-off. If I can hold on to the Straits of Hormuz.
Yeah. More likely, given the players, that's going to be the highly enriched uranium is going to be an issue where both sides cave and neither side admits it. I think that what you've been saying about the Strait of Hormuz is absolutely front and center. But I have a Joe Trippi-like question that I'd like to ask both you, David, and the other Joe. How do you think this is going to play here politically? How is this going to affect Trump's standing? How is this are people going to even remember this when we get around to November, to the elections? Go ahead, guys, either one of you.
Well, I think a key question there for David is where will gasoline prices be and for how long? Because I understand what the question, Joe, but from at least my read, gasoline prices aren't going down for months. Could be 3 months, could be, and this is if the straits all this over the next few weeks it starts to unwind, which I'm not even sure that can happen. I mean, even during the 2 weeks, we're already seeing, as you said today, only 4 tankers or 4 ships have made it out. If that continues for any length of time, including stopping right now and everything's open, you're talking about months of before I think gas prices go anywhere near $3 a gallon, if ever. So that right there just tells me there will be plenty of memory about that, about the impact that by the way, the layering on of tariffs and all the other cost impacts that have happened that make people fret about, and rightly so, about affordability. This is going to add to it and continue to for months. So I don't see any way that there's some kind of magic bullet that gets a bunch of independents and other people to go, oh yeah, this is great. Now I'm going to vote. I'm going to move back in the direction of Trump and MAGA. I think that ship sailed, and I don't think this helps.
David, what do you think?
Well, far be it from me to second guess Joe or you on American politics. I came up.
Give us a global perspective then.
Yeah.
Well, I came to Washington in the Carter administration, and I remember the uncanny ability of that Iranian government to extract humiliation in painful doses, leading up to President Carter's run for re-election. And I would be very surprised if the Iranians did not take the opportunity with their control of the Straits, if they still have it, to have to take the opportunity to remind the American people the consequences of this war. The revenge is a dish served with joy in the Gulf, in the Persian Gulf, on both sides, and I think, as Joe says, I mean, the American people have a history of not making their votes dependent on foreign policy issues, unless we're in the middle of a very big hot war. But the nominee for how they feel about this war is likely to be, as we've all learned, the price of gasoline, and the price of a host of other exports that come out of the Gulf that will contribute to a general inflationary impact on the world and to a lesser degree on the United States. So I think Joe's right. I think they're gonna look at the prices. They're gonna look at their economic conditions, which was their concern before this war, and say to themselves, "Am I better or worse off as a result of this war?" And I think they're going to generally conclude worse off. And I think the Iranians are going to take the opportunity to remind them of that from time to time as we move toward the midterms, because I believe the Iranian government are smart enough analysts of American political scene to understand these midterms offer them a real opportunity to influence American politics and the American posture.
Yeah, and they haven't shied away from that in the past. So,
Joe, what effect though does the fact that Trump is going to be touting this massive victory, and his various minions are going to be touting the same thing, but the dent in your wallet from the gas prices and fertilizer prices and all the rest, aluminum, I understand, is going to be significant. Who do you trust? Donald Trump's lips or the size of your wallet? And so far, to an amazing extent, the American people have been incredibly tolerant of the nonsense that comes out of Donald Trump's mouth.
I don't think so. I mean, you look at again, a couple of specials over elections over the last week, over on Tuesday. I mean, Sean Harris, I think, outperformed in that district by 25 points.
This is
There,
Georgia district that was the Marjorie Taylor Greene
district, the Wisconsin Supreme Court, where which has usually been a Donnybrook. Elon Musk put millions and millions into it, and it was close last time, but Democrats won. This time, the Democrat, won by a massive landslide, and there was almost no. The battle was like over before it began because of how independents have broken to the Democrats. They're done with him. I mean, they were done with him before this war. That's my point. I mean, I'm not, and frankly, the really fascinating polling data, and this was yesterday. Do you support what's Trump on the war? No, was 58. Do you think he's what the attacks you're against them? The next thing you could say was that it was appropriate, and the last one was he didn't hit him hard enough. Okay, 58% said against it. 23% or something like that said, "Oh no, it's been perfect, it's appropriate, etc." That's got to be his MAGA base. The really interesting one was the 13% who said, no, he didn't hit him hard enough. Now, that's the split in the Republican Party right now, because there are no Democrats and no independents saying, no, we didn't hit him hard enough, or any of those other questions. They answered it with, we're against it. What you saw was 2/3 of the Republican Party said it's perfect, it's great, Goldilocks, what he did. And a third of them, we keep seeing this number, a third, 31% of the Republican Party didn't think that ICE was being brutal enough, tough enough. And still the same, a third of the party, if you calculate out what that 13% that don't, no, they weren't, we didn't, he wasn't tough enough and hasn't hit Iran strongly enough. And so that's the politics of this. Or the 58 gone. I'm telling you, they're gone. And this didn't help. And now his problem is 2/3 of his party, a third of his party wants him to, I think, is going to be upset because they wanted him to go in and do it all. Literally,
the neoconservative sliver that still remains.
Yeah, still there.
Could David, let's go back to the region for a minute. What's the impact of all this on Israel? I mean, it's my suspicion that if you're right, if the Gulf states no longer trust the American umbrella, protective umbrella, the nuclear umbrella, is it possible that the Gulf states will turn to Israel because they certainly haven't shown any restraint at all?
Joe, I'm tempted to say no. Israel's capability to defend itself was no better than the United States' capability to defend the Gulf states. The place that probably the most deft political move I saw during the 3-week conflict has been Zelensky's travels through the Gulf, signing multi-billion-dollar deals to send them drones and to send them, defensive drones. I don't know I don't know the likely impact on the Gulf states' current relations with Israel, but I don't see a basis for it to improve. And another reason for that is because, to the extent that this ceasefire, which the Gulf states desperately want to hold, even obviously they don't like the idea that the straits are in the hands of the Iranians, but on the other hand, they don't want a conflagration that destroys their desalination plants and results in a 90% loss of their people, leaving out of an inability to get water. The potential fragility of their position can't be overlooked. So if you bear that in mind, I think they didn't want an even larger conflagration because of the risk, the real risk that they would not be able to defend themselves against these incoming missiles and drones from Iran hitting critical infrastructure. So if you add all that up, what that tells you is that the idea that Israel would continue the war with Hezbollah and Lebanon and stoke the possibility of a renewal of conflict with Iran across the Gulf is not in their interest. So the insistence by Netanyahu on continuing the Lebanese conflict that he started, I think the Gulf states will take great issue with and consider a grave source of threat to them.
Although he's doing it with the tacit approval of the Lebanese government, which is very different from these kind of incursions, which have occurred at like 5-year intervals by Israel into Lebanon in the past. I think Lebanon has a chance, if Israel actually succeeds in this effort, Lebanon has a chance of becoming a country again.
I share your hope. This new Lebanese government is a real improvement, finally. But I fear that the conflict with Iran is going to render Gulf states' ambitions for a future Lebanon in a very distant second place of importance to preventing further conflict between themselves and Iran that could further damage their essential infrastructure to the maintenance of their populations in the Gulf and the maintenance of their economies.
Right. Well, we are running out of time. You've been very generous with your time, David. Joe, you got some closing thoughts?
No, just thanks, David, for your insight and your analysis. You can, David, is there anywhere place where people can learn more or follow what what you're thinking, or are you online much, or is there a company or something they can look up if they want to learn more?
Yeah, there's a company called QR Intel, which will be starting a Substack, I think, next week, which will be issuing regular reports on the situation in the Gulf and the Iran war, and they can subscribe to that Substack and get our views.
Great.
Thank you both for having me on, and I'm a big fan of the show, and I'm honored to have joined you today.
Great. Thanks again, David, for being with us. Joe, you got any last words?
No, but I once your Substack goes up, I'm going to tell my Sanity Clause subscribers about it and encourage them to sign in.
Great.
Cool.
Thank you.
Thanks all. Thanks all for joining us. Thanks, David.
Bye-bye.
Let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself.